We're ready if you are. You're still muted.
I lost my control panel to unmute
Oh,
myself whenever to share screen. So here we go. Okay, can you see and hear me okay?
mm-hmm.
Great, okay. So thank you, all of you for inviting me and for kind of teeing up this topic in your first moments together this morning. Jane, I particularly appreciated your Earth Mother story. I'm going to have to order that book. That was just absolutely perfect. And and then also the meditation thought about planting trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. That too was spot on for thinking about the choices that we make today and the impacts that they have on others down the line that, long after we are either gone from this earth or gone from the place where we currently live. And I've been thinking a lot these last few years about our urban spaces. And I think particularly living in Florida, where we're seeing, rapid development occur all over the state. We think about it in our own little neck of the woods, in our own town or our own county, but it's happening everywhere. And and it's disturbing to many of us to see, massive forests just totally clear cut and wiped out, and mass graded, and then little monopoly houses popping up, cookie cutter houses that all look the same with just a little stick of a tree out front. It's been very disturbing. And so anyway, I've been thinking a lot about this. Last night I was at a Martin Luther King gala at Stetson and we had this phenomenal keynote speaker slash singer who, Donnie McClurkin, who he's a Grammy Award winning performer and pastor. And he was just extraordinary and inspiring us. But he talked a lot about progress that, for issues of racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, we've made so much progress, but we're not there yet. We're not to that point of perfect unity. And yet I thought, okay, well, as we've made so many social justice strides, what have we done with the environment along the way? It seems like in many ways we're going backwards in terms of how we're living in the environment. And of course, it's because the population keeps growing. Even as population growth has slowed its pace, we are still kind of in an upward trajectory of human growth across the planet. We hit 8 billion people on the planet in November of 2022. And I think the projection is to hit 9 billion by 2037. So just 15 years from now, we will have added another billion people. And, there are a lot of people, ecologists, environmental scientists, politicians, futurists, people with all kinds of different perspectives and interests, often ask this question: where shall all these people live? And it isn't that the planet isn't big enough to spread 8 billion people out, evenly across the planet. It's just that not every place on the planet is all that easy to inhabit. And yet, we have learned to inhabit places that, maybe historically weren't all that amenable to living, in deserts or Arctic areas or whatever. So, so this becomes a question, will people continue to concentrate in cities as they have done? I think it was 2012 where we kind of tipped over the 50% mark of how many of those people live in cities versus in more rural areas. And since 2012, more and more people have begun to concentrate in cities. And where do you put them in cities? If there was another sort of kind of theoretical exercise that somebody did that said, if we were to pack all those people into one vertical skyscraper, all 8 billion people in a vertical skyscraper, how big would it need to be? And so this little image down in the bottom is of a skyscraper that's, I think it's a 1 square mile um, footprint that goes several miles up into the atmosphere. And, that's what it would take if we concentrated it in one point. Of course, that's silly, but we are seeing in our bigger cities, bigger and bigger skyscrapers, bigger and bigger buildings that are concentrating both economic and residential functions. Some futurists think about maybe we could build our cities up above our nature and have everything elevated, sort of a Jetsons lifestyle where we leave the ground for all the other species and we live above it. Um, First of all, that's not realistic because, we do still have to reach the ground for a lot of our resources, for food, for water, um, for the things that keep us alive. So those are just kind of ideas that are way far out there, but they're getting closer and closer to reality all the time. So, um, so I kind of put this in the context of our call to stewardship. And of course, you all have this as one of your key principles. I think most of our world religions have a call to take care of the natural world around us in one form or another. Images like this to the right, it's in my mind, they're kind of silly because they are, to me, they're not ecologically representative. But on the other hand, they're giving the idea that all of these species have always coexisted, and humans have been yet another species that lived in coexistence. I won't say harmony, but in coexistence with many other species. And so, my point today is how do we steward nature within our cities rather than thinking about nature as a thing that's over there, somewhere else outside of cities, that we must protect with, grand efforts of land conservation and policy. Like, how can we do it in our own front yards and backyards? How do we live within the garden and not separate from it? How do we care for all creation, all creatures? And what does coexistence look like? We talk a lot about coexistence in the social justice setting, when we think about getting along with different cultures and different religions across the world and within our own communities. But, we need the same concept of coexistence for thinking about coexisting with nature. Can we do this even as we accommodate 8 to 9 billion people in a very high-tech economy? So, within Florida, there have been great strides. Of course, we're perhaps a little bit discouraged right now with the current political landscape in Florida. Um, but even with that, there have continued to be great strides in protecting certain parts of the natural systems in Florida. And I just acknowledge the fact that the Florida Wildlife Corridor continues to get funding and protection and the ability to expand its boundaries, even in conservative dominated legislatures and executive offices. I like to introduce the idea of matrix and corridors. The matrix is sort of the background ecological condition, the different habitat types across the state. We know that a lot of those habitats have been converted to agriculture or to urban land uses, but there's still patches of those that kind of make up what was that original matrix. But we also know that we need to protect corridors. And I want to talk about spatial scale today. Like, we know we're working through this Florida Wildlife Corridor to protect massive corridors throughout the state, huge chunks of land. But what about the finer grain networks of corridors through our own backyards and through our own cities? Creating that connectivity across the state to connect patches and maintain what was the original matrix is the goal. And it's the goal for a lot of reasons, because we know we need to protect these other creatures. We know we need it for protecting our water supply. But also, as we move into an increasingly disrupted and shifted climate across the planet, we know that a lot of our species are going to need to migrate in the northern hemisphere to migrate northward. And we need to protect habitat connections so they can make those not just seasonal migrations, but long-term migrations safely. And so again, thinking about the ways that we define and protect corridors is really the goal here. Here's another view of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And of course, this is coming from the International Space Station, I believe. And you can see the dark areas of Florida where there is less development. Some of these areas may be dominated by agriculture, but in many cases, they are natural areas that are preserved. So when you see the state lit up like this, you can see where there are perhaps barriers. I think most of us are aware of the dark sky movement that, even in urban areas, we try to prevent lights from shining too much into the sky because that disrupts migratory bird patterns that are kind of moving across the space at night. But we see kind of a big barrier along the I-4 corridor here between Daytona and through Orlando down to Tampa. And some of the really critical areas that we need to protect are through that zone that is so densely urbanized. So let me go back to, where's Volusia County in this? Over here, we can see we've got big chunks of the wildlife corridor coming through our county, and our county has robust conversations going on about how to protect that through our Volusia Forever program and several other strategies for purchasing land for conservation and working in partnership with private landowners to conserve land as well. So within the county, we've got kind of three different zones. We've got the river corridor along the St. Johns River on the west side. I sometimes call it the west coast of Volusia County. And that's a particular set of riverine wetland habitats that are essential. And of course, those are in many places connected to either state public lands or the federal lands of the National Wildlife Refuges or the National Forest. We also talk about the sort of eco area through the middle of the county, which we sometimes lovingly call the Palmetto Curtain. But we have a lot of lowlands or swamplands in the middle of the county that have been protected from development, or at least in sort of lower impact land uses like agriculture. Our cities are continuing to encroach on this land in the center, as we know. We look at New Smyrna and Daytona pushing westward, and our west side cities creeping eastward. So we have to think about the future of those. And then, of course, our Indian River Lagoon, Halifax River corridor is another important area to preserve. Each one of these is a different collection of ecosystems with different functions. And we need to think about those. We also tend to, I think in Florida, for all the jokes about developing swampland in Florida, we have historically built on highland. We build in the uplands because that is where the risks are lowest for flooding. And yet it's the uplands where our aquifer is recharged. The lowlands are where the aquifer seeps out. And so we need those areas in the uplands where water can continue to percolate. In 2005, the Smart Growth Plan for the county set aside these kind of ecological corridor areas and said, we're going to concentrate our growth primarily through infill and through limiting sprawl in our municipal areas. And that's kind of a lovely idea, but being a occasional radical in front of the county council, one time I was speaking to them about the wildlife corridor, and I said, we need to think about every square foot from the river to the sea as wildlife corridor. Every single street, every single backyard and front yard and commercial landscape needs to be part of this wildlife corridor. And they just looked at me like I was crazy, but I don't care. That's, that's the idea that I'm trying to promote, is making sure that even in our urban areas, we are supporting coexistence. Nature is not just a thing that's over there. It has to be with us and among us. So this paradigm shift is really about how do we create spaces on a much finer scale and corridors on a much finer scale to support the wildlife that lived here long before we got here. And we have to think about these things, like what geometries work best for providing for these different species. Some species, like the panther or bears or coyotes, need large protected spaces, and others can live in smaller patches as long as they're connected to other patches. And so, we have to work with our wildlife biologists and our conservation land managers to think about how we organize those spaces to work for the other species we're wanting to protect. So, many of you know that I live in Southeast DeLand in the um, highly controversial neighborhood of Victoria Park, which um, for the battles that were fought against that in the late 1990s. One of the things that emerged from that battle was that over 450 acres of land was preserved for gopher tortoises and scrub jays and indigo snakes and sandhill crane nesting areas and Florida black bears and a lot of other species that had lived in there. And if you read the original development plan, that again was, the language in there was hard won by environmental leaders in our communities at that time. They also talked about priority yard in the little neighborhood parks within the built environment, and making sure that those built areas, those built landscapes use the same native plants of the surrounding conserved lands. So there would be that connectivity, that matrix, that, just because there's a house here doesn't mean that it isn't habitable for all the other species that live next door in the conservation land. That was the idea. It was a beautiful idea. As time has passed, 20 plus years since that time, I think that the neighborhood has shifted away from that. The different builders that have done the landscape installations haven't really followed those rules, and homeowners have changed out their landscapes to more traditional landscapes that are dominated by non-native plants or by things that are not necessarily welcoming to the insects and the mammals and reptiles and everything else that are native to here. So this is what we're trying to do. How do we rethink infill? Okay, so let's say that we all agree that sprawl is bad, but we're going to focus on developing the vacant spaces that remain inside of our cities. Those infill redevelopments are still opportunities for having better quality of life for both humans and other species within our city boundaries. So you may be familiar with the concept of urban heat islands. Urban heat islands are that's the word we use for saying that cities tend to be warmer on hot summer days than the surrounding rural area because of all of the buildings and the roads and sidewalks and parking lots that absorb heat during the day and radiate it back out at night. If you have more green spaces within your city, whether that's street trees or small parks or even green roofs, it can help absorb a lot of that heat, but convert it. This is now where I'm going to go biochemistry on you for about 3 seconds. Photosynthesis is an amazing thing. It actually converts heat and light from the sun into into chemical energy that is biomass and food. And so, if you don't have photosynthesis going on, it's just re-radiating heat back out into our space. Um, so we need more green spaces to do that. We also don't have to buy all this land with public dollars. If we can work with private landowners to think creatively about how to make their spaces be greener and more welcoming to other species, it can work. So we look for opportunities like this to have more corridors connected throughout cities, connecting parks, following riverways. I would like to, like I said, see every square foot be like this, but to be more intentional, where the picture on the bottom left, I forget which city this in, could just be, a wide open concrete canal. This city has transformed that waterway into a lush green space that also becomes an amenity for the city where people can go and enjoy walking and lots of other species can live there. Um, we have to think about the places in our cities that present barriers or are deserts for wildlife or for the species that are trying to move through. We think about food deserts as places where humans can't easily access food, but we have deserts within our cities that are places where other species just simply can't find a place to rest and live. Okay. And again, this is kind of the example I was talking about with the original vision, for my neighborhood, which is that we want to look at our surrounding landscape, see what species live there, and bring those, invite those, plant those in our own yards to create that continuity. In the bottom picture, you kind of see the what not to do in the background of this picture where it's brown and some guy is mowing his lawn. Like let's try to recreate our natural areas in our own residential spaces. There's a movement right now that is kind of a derivative of a movement that's been going on for a long time, but led by an ecologist named Doug Tallamy. He launched this idea called Homegrown National Park and basically said we could double the protected acreage of natural systems and protect biodiversity. We could double the amount of land that is currently in national parks if we would just take our own yards and urban spaces that we have control over and begin to plant native plants and recreate habitats that were there before they got developed. And again, create that connectivity. And a program that's been around a lot longer is through the National Wildlife Federation called the Certified Backyard Wildlife Habitat. And it doesn't have to be your backyard, it can be your front yard too. And both of those are websites that Jane included in the opening slideshow. Those are websites that have a bunch of resources for trying to do this and getting certified as well. So the quote that she used earlier from Doug Tallamy is, in the past, we've asked one thing of our gardens, that they be pretty. Now they have to support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. And they can, and they do all of those things if we do them right. Finally, and again, this is why I loved the Earth Mother book that Jane chose, is I don't think any of us would argue that we love to coexist with the species that we love, right? We love seeing our birds in our backyard. We put up our bird feeders. We love having our sandhill cranes poking around, eating grubs and stuff from our yards. Some people get impatient when they're, slowly crossing the road, but whatever, this is Florida life. But, we love our butterflies. We're a monarch city in DeLand and love to see our butterflies coming around. So we know how to plant butterfly attracting gardens. Our gopher tortoises are protected, other turtles that are moving amongst our ponds. It's always fun to see those. Some people don't appreciate them, but I think most of us, think they're delightful. And other small mammals. But what about the pestier things? What about raccoons or possums or deer, other rodents, squirrels, rabbits? some people are like, I don't want that stuff around. It's gonna eat my flowers. Or I have a rabbit that's been, every time I try to plant new native plants in my front yard, there's a rabbit that comes around and eats them all. And I'm like, okay. Um, and, possums are highly underappreciated, but they're amazing creatures. And, so there are these creatures that we're kind of ambivalent about, kind of like to see them from afar as long as they're not messing with our perfect yards. But then of course there's that whole other set, the man in the storybook, like, I just want the mosquitoes to go away, and the frog just wants the man to go away, and the mosquito just wants the frog to go away. We have these other species that we've been conditioned to fear. And they lived here before us. They are problematic. They seem problematic because we think that they can hurt us. And in fact, they do sometimes. I put a little red X over the one picture in the bottom because that's a Burmese python. It's a non-native snake. There are big python hunts in South Florida to try to keep these populations under control. But most of our native predatory species, including things like mosquitoes and ticks and things, they are part of our ecosystems. And, and they are keeping under control perhaps some of those species that, that we're more ambivalent about. So, so figuring out how to kind of shift a mindset so that coexistence with these species can be okay, giving those species a place to live so that they don't need to come inside our houses is perhaps the sort of simple solution there. So the last thing, another resource to introduce you to, if you're not aware of it, is a book that has been published. It's now in its second edition, called The New Yard Pattern Book. And it is put together by the Outside Collaborative, which is a group of landscape architects, engineers, nursery suppliers, dominated by Cherry Lake Tree Farm in the Kissimmee Claremont area. They have created this book for both individual homeowners as well as groups that are working on developing whole new developments to help us think about what it looks like to have a yard that can be connected to our natural systems. So you can find this, download it for free online, the New Yard Pattern Book from Outside Collaborative. I like to promote that. So, I think the bottom line is we have to create the space and take up space for these other species, and then share the word. I love making presentations to small and big groups across society to just make people aware of the opportunities, of the need, and of the resources. So you can do that too. And I know I've gone a little bit over, so I'll just wrap up there and turn it back over. So thank you. Have I stopped sharing my screen?
Yes,
Okay, good. Great.
I was waiting for the recording to stop.
Okay.
But I think I'll just go ahead. And if we're recording this last part, I don't think it will be a problem. Thank you, Wendy. That
Sure.
was lovely. I learned a lot. I've got notes here of things to order. So let's hope it makes a small but impactful difference in how we all treat our own yards and flower beds, etc. Okay, we will now have our closing reading and chalice extinguishing, and Teresa will be giving our chalice extinguishing reading.
When we take fire from our chalice, it does not become less, it becomes more. And so we extinguish our chalice, but we take its light and warmth with us, multiplying their power by all of our lives and sharing it with the world.
Thank you, Teresa, and everyone who helped out today. Here's those announcements that Judy made about the MLK March tomorrow and the meeting at Earl Brown Park if you're in the DeLand area. And we'll leave that up for a couple of minutes, and then it will be time to go have coffee or iced tea or whatever you would like, and stick around for some chat. And I hope Wendy can stay for a minute or two in case anybody has any questions. Okay, thank you all. That ends our service for today. So you can all unmute.
I have a question. Will you
Okay.
come and speak with us again?
Sure, anytime. And I've got lots of other topics too, but yeah, I'm always happy to chat. I like to give a presentation with different variations on a thing I call agrihoods, so there's protecting kind of natural systems, but there's